Climactic change, 20 million hands in the living, wavering globe. Last August, I heard an NPR discussion of climate change in relation to the Inflation Reduction Act, a bill designating almost $800 billion to energy security and climate change. The show's host emphasized that, per the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, fossil fuel usage must fall dramatically within 10 years to keep the Earth's warming by 2100 below 1.5 degrees Celsius. She asked the director of the Bureau of Land Management, Tracy Stone Manning, quote, "Is this process that we're currently following going to get us there?" End quote. To my astonishment, Ms. Stone Manning replied, quote, "Yes. Yes is the answer," end quote. The unequivocal answer was surprising given the BLM's equivocal charge. As manager of federal lands, it is one of its responsibilities is to award oil and gas leases. So, somehow, partly as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, we will as a nation, albeit a politically divided one, meet requirements to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius while still doling out oil and gas leases and without asking our citizenry to make substantive behavioral changes. Ms. Stone Manning's response reminded me of the 2015 Paris Climate Accords, which the United States initially joined before withdrawing under President Trump and then rejoining under President Biden. These accords set as their upper target 2 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, and their ideal target is 1.5 degrees Celsius. The latter requires a 50% cut in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. What distressed me about the accords, however, was that the agreed upon means in no conceivable way could meet that goal. The modeling studies grounding the accords clearly showed that. In fact, annual global greenhouse gas emissions are higher now than they were in 2015. The Accord set 2030 as their deadline for a 50% cut. Over half of that time has elapsed, and we are further from that goal now than when we started. Fundamental reasons explain why we've made so little progress cutting greenhouse gases, reasons which we haven't seriously confronted politically or socially. We may think, for example, that electric cars will save us. We even call them, falsely, emissions-free vehicles. This falsehood epitomizes the problem. We are too comfortable imagining vehicles have no emissions if we see no tailpipes. We forget that the missing tailpipe is actually a power plant smokestack. Such forgetfulness is encouraged by those who understand that part of what they're selling is a clean conscience, moreover, one which allows us to get on with our lives without substantively changing them. Even if we correct this forgetfulness, we too comfortably believe that the gases causing climate change are mostly the consequences of vehicles and residences. Hence, the solution is electric cars and solar panels. Globally, however, ground transportation and residential sources account for only 1/3 of annual anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Our fossil fuel dependence goes well beyond our vehicles and homes. In particular, let me call attention to 4 material mainstays of modern civilization which are fossil fuel intensive: plastic, steel, concrete, and ammonia fertilizers. Collectively, they require about 20% of the world's primary energy supply and generate at least 25% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Consider all the plastic you handle every day. Consider the steel and plastic required for even an electric car. Consider the steel, plastic, and concrete needed for solar panel installation and building construction, including LEED-certified green buildings. Consider projections that plastic production will double by 2045, and the world's building stock by 2060. That latter is equivalent to building a new New York City every month of every year between now and then. Consider the immense quantities of fertilizer needed to sustain 8 billion people and their animals. Consider how energy-intensive food production in the Western world is, where every calorie of food requires about a dozen calories of fossil fuels, and where in the United States 30 to 40% of that food is thrown away. Consider, in short, how fossil fuel intensive a transition to a green economy will necessarily be. Now ask yourself, what dream are we dreaming which says we can go green without really changing? That message is loudly proclaimed by many on the left. Let's have a green revolution, they say, so we don't have to change. Can there be a revolution without profound change? Many on the left say, make fairly minor changes so you don't really have to change. Many on the right say, it's all an exaggeration or a hoax. Change isn't needed. If anything, we should change back. Instead of focusing on the disagreement between right and left, notice their substantive agreement. The difference is between not changing and changing very little. Should we take seriously that climate change is an exaggeration, a hoax, mere self-interested alarmism? On the one hand, of course we should. The computer models which divide the Earth into enormous numbers of grid squares and try to calculate the consequences of every significant biological, chemical, and physical process in each square are beyond the critical ken of a human mind. A projection 100 years into the future requires 1,000,000 billion calculations. Many are simply parameterizations of phenomena we don't understand. The interdisciplinarity upon which climate research rests is also often authority-driven, collaborative in the mode of deference more than of criticism. Major incentives to jump on the climate change bandwagon also exist, including career and funding incentives. We'd be naive to imagine all that away, as, even more importantly, we'd be naive not to wonder about the competence which synthesizes so much specialized knowledge, assuming we can tell what is and isn't knowledge. On the other hand, warranted skepticism does not deliver us to the knowledge that it's all a hoax. Far from it. We've had warnings growing in clarity and urgency since a pioneering paper by Arrhenius in 1896. In 1938, Callendar calculated that the planet had warmed about 1/4 degree Celsius over the previous half-century due to carbon dioxide production by fuel combustion. He then developed a basic model which predicted that at around 420 part per million atmospheric carbon dioxide, we should expect about 1 degree Celsius of warming relative to 1938. We are now around 420 part per million carbon dioxide, and we've had about 1 degree Celsius of warming relative to 1938. Since then, models have become more complicated and refined, offering high-resolution predictions of what global temperature increases mean at regional scales. They've added ocean and atmospheric circulation and positive and negative feedbacks. They've incorporated responses of the living world. They've even charted possible social and political responses. But the problem's basic contours, the relation of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel combustion to planetary warming and the consequent dangers, have been reasonably well understood for decades. To some degree, we've allowed ourselves to be distracted by seeking ever greater refinements of the simulacra by which we make this problem visible, as if simulacra could stand in for the world where the problem must be addressed, and as if the indefinite pursuit of knowledge weren't itself a deferral of behavioral change. Accepting, then, that climate change is real, how alarmed should we be? After all, the world has had higher carbon dioxide concentrations than now. The last time the planet had comparable carbon dioxide concentrations was 4.3 million years ago, in the mid-Pliocene. The planet was about 3 degrees Celsius warmer than now. That may not sound like a lot, given diurnal temperature changes in New Mexico of about 15 degrees Celsius and seasonal ones of about 20 degrees Celsius. But those 3 degrees Celsius corresponded to a planet many would find unfamiliar, where sea levels were 75 feet higher than today, Florida a mere nub, and southeastern Mexico underwater. Our nearest relative 4 million years ago was Australopithecus. It would be another million years before the genus Homo appeared. Obviously, there weren't 8 billion people on Earth. Human civilization 4.3 million years ago was still roughly 4.3 million years in the future. A reminder that civilization is young. Besides different atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, Earth has also had dramatically different temperature regimes. It has been much colder. I'm not talking Pleistocene ice ages, but something much more extreme. Snowball Earth episodes around 600 to 700 million years ago when the planet was close to globally glaciated. The planet has also been much warmer, including during the Cretaceous hothouse 110 million years ago, and 56 million years ago, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when the poles were ice-free and alligators swam in an Arctic lined by palm trees. If it comforts you to know the planet can handle much colder and warmer temperatures, if you think that means there's nothing to worry about, consider rates of change. During the Cretaceous hothouse, the planet warmed about 0.000025 degrees Celsius per century, for a total warming of about 5 degrees Celsius over millions of years. During the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the rate of warming was 1,000 times faster, 0.025 degrees Celsius per century, again for a total warming of about 5 degrees Celsius over tens of thousands of years, a warming coincident with an extinction event. In contrast, we've already warmed about 1 degree Celsius in the last century, with future warming projected at as much as 5.7 degrees Celsius by 2100, depending on what we do. That 5.7 degrees Celsius, equivalent to the warming which occurred over millions of years during the Cretaceous hothouse and tens of thousands of years during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, is according to the IPCC's least optimistic emissions scenario. But that scenario is the one which most accurately matches actual cumulative emissions since 2005, predicting them within 1%. The, to my eye, unrealistic goal of the Paris Climate Accords is to limit warming to a mere 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius this century. We're banking on that, with most of us not realizing how dramatic a rate of planetary warming that actually is, to say nothing of what may happen after 2100. These numbers make even more sense from another angle. It took hundreds of millions of years to accumulate fossil fuel reserves which we've injected into the atmosphere over a few centuries, and most in 1 century. In terms of biogeochemical cycles, that's a discrepancy in rates of 6 orders of magnitude. In short, the rate of planetary perturbation is extraordinary, especially in the context of the relative stability of climate which has pertained for most of the period civilization has flourished. That rate of change is a more threatening aspect of climate change than the fact of warming. We are not just facing a world of enhanced drought and intensified storms, where the Great Salt Lake becomes an empty basin and metropolises drain dry the aquifers on which they rely and rest, while sea levels gradually rise and forest fires rage. We are facing a world which is fundamentally and rapidly reorganizing, where the last calendar year, 2023, was possibly the hottest in the last 100,000 years, but likely won't hold that record for long, where, in most of our lifetimes, the Arctic's radiation-reflecting, heat-reducing toupee of sea ice, whose maximum extent 20 years ago was 14 million square kilometers, will disappear seasonally, and where, partly as a consequence of the melting sea ice, a major conveyor of heat on the planet, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation will dramatically weaken or shut down, fundamentally changing the distribution of heat on Earth. This will matter, not just to us, but to innumerable organisms who, like us, depend on fairly predictable patterns which are already becoming unreliable. It's not clear that most organisms and ecosystems can respond fast enough. In the Pleistocene ice ages, a primary response was migration, moving north and south and up and down mountains as ice advanced and retreated. But those migrations typically occurred over longer timescales than we face, and, perhaps even more importantly, on a planet much less fragmented by human-created barriers. We are currently in the midst of the 7th mass extinction event in Earth's Metazoan history, with extinction rates 1,000 times faster than background. We should worry. How much worse will it get? In lieu of imagining all species as rugged individuals with independent fates, we should also worry about how interconnected the ecological world is and how linked all of our fates may be. So here we are, faced with an ongoing mass extinction event and dramatic rates of planetary change. What are we doing? We are persisting in the dream that we can carry on more or less as we imagine we always have, that necessary changes are only on the fringes. Indeed, the Inflation Reduction Act sets aside $161 million to restore landscapes to historic conditions because, according to the BLM director, quote, "A restored landscape is more naturally in balance. That natural cycle that has been with us for the millennia, that's what we need to strive to restore," end quote. Setting aside the question of whether nature has ever really been in balance, setting aside as well the question of what we mean by nature, though I imagine that that's a question that will be addressed on Sunday for those of you who can go, we still should confront the smaller question: why are we trying to restore natural cycles of past millennia in a dramatically changed and dramatically changing world? I see groups dedicated to eradicating alien species. I hear in the Ecological Register a disturbing echo of a terrifying political project. It really worries me. But I also don't understand what our thinking is: to eradicate immigrant species when the scale of planetary change confronting us likely can be met for many organisms, probably including humans, only by massive migration. And I wonder, what is it exactly that we're trying to preserve, and why? Is this another manifestation of how we want to have a revolution without changing? How we want, as it were, to spin our wheels? I observed earlier that civilization is very young. In roughly 10,000 years, we've gone from Neolithic clusters to New York City, while the global human population has exploded. When Socrates lived, the world probably hosted about 100 million people. Roughly the same numbers now live in just 3 cities: Tokyo, Jakarta, and Delhi. It took all of human history to reach 1 billion people around 1800, and another century plus to reach 2 billion when my grandmother was born. When my mother was born, 2.5 billion people lived on Earth. When my sister was born, 25 years later, there were 4 billion. In 2022, we hit 8 billion, with 11 billion expected by 2100. Let me state the obvious. This enormous growth has occurred in nearly exact conjunction with our intensive utilization of fossil fuels. This should impress upon us our extreme dependence on fossil fuels, even while we imagine we can painlessly switch to new energy sources without substantively changing our lives. In fact, per the Inflation Reduction Act, we plan to restore natural cycles to patterns from the last millennia as if the dramatic transformation of Earth by human activities over those same millennia doesn't really count. If we wish to be serious about climate change, we must do much more. We must let go of many familiar things. We must understand that restoration is mostly off the table, or else is a nostalgic, aesthetic illusion. We must stop pretending that we can achieve a transformation without parallel in human history on the back of only minor inconveniences. Two paths stretch before us. One relies almost exclusively on technology, whether existent technology yet to be built to scale, or technology that doesn't even exist, in the hopes that it will deliver us from having to make substantive changes, as if technology itself weren't a substantive change, and further in the hopes that it doesn't have unforeseen consequences, though history is rife with those consequences, not least of which is climate change. I call this path the path of technotheology. Rather than praying to the storm god to have mercy on us, we will pray to AI. This path leads, inevitably, to geoengineering, or rather, to further geoengineering. For, against the backdrop of our increasing awareness of its planetary consequences, what has our massive utilization of fossil fuels become but a kind of geoengineering? The oceanographers Ravel and Suess observed in 1957 that, quote, human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment that could not have happened in the past, nor be reproduced in the future. Within a few centuries, we are returning to the atmosphere and oceans the concentrated organic matter stored in sedimentary rocks over hundreds of millions of years, end quote. Doesn't such a large-scale geophysical experiment sound like geoengineering? That is not to say it's a geoengineering with a master engineer in charge. Like every human endeavor, it's been some combination of chosen and fallen into, conscious and unconscious. But so will any future geoengineering be as well. I dread the day when a rogue nation or trillionaire unilaterally commits Earth to another uncontrolled experiment in the name of salvation. I dread the mindset which imagines we're sufficiently self-present to undertake the governance of the natural world, the dominion over the universe which Bacon prophesied, or which imagines that dominion is instead the province of AI. I dread the ideologies, so many already in circulation, which will justify any action in terms not of the existential threat of a changing planet, but of the absolute supremacy of human beings and of subgroups among them. It seems to me that this is the track we are most likely to follow, because of that siren's song that it sings to us that we won't have to change, though that promise is a lie, and we will eventually discover ourselves as changed as Milton's fallen angels. Among the forms of this technotheology is the technological creation of illusions we desire, the technological creation of a cave we like. We don't want just to geoengineer the world. We want to retreat from the world that is into one of our own devising. This comes to mind when I consider the Fabian allure of massive climate simulations, but no less when I consider the aptly named Marvel Cinematic Universe, or when I watch parents at playgrounds engrossed not by their children but by their phones, or when I ponder why cars are so important to us, those wheeled would-be biospheres with their own entertainment systems and climate control. These are all, at least in part, escapes, caves we retreat to in order not to stare at the sun or to feel its heat. Fear no more the heat of the sun, thinks Virginia Woolf's character Clarissa Dalloway as she prepares her party and contemplates her mortality. Fear no more the heat of the sun, thinks another of Woolf's characters, Septimus Warren Smith, even as he's about to plunge holding his treasure. They're both quoting a line from a funeral dirge in Shakespeare's Cymbeline. And this retreat that I'm describing, this technotheological embrace of the cave, this path which I think we're mostly following, is in equal measure that song of sorrow which declares we are afraid to live. Well, we should be. It takes gigantic courage to live even a single day. That's the techno-theological path stretching before us. The path of technological illusion and of a godlike faith in technology, but also of retreat into made-up worlds, the bubbles of social media, CGI, and cars, while in our hearts suspecting that this also deforms us and tears us apart. The other path, the more difficult and the more hopeful one, places the burden of response and of responsibility not only on technology, though we will need it, but on ourselves. It rejects that we are helpless to change, or that our only hope of change is to convince politicians and corporations to make the changes for us. We have become shockingly accustomed to imagining ourselves as mere followers, and our politicians, for whom we frequently express disdain, as nonetheless leaders. They're not necessarily leaders. In this country, they are first and foremost our representatives. The difficult, more hopeful path begins by taking seriously that they do represent us, that corporations do too, that what we behold in them is a representation of what we are. While it's comforting and not wholly false to imagine tycoons making gazillions of dollars off of us helpless dupes, we must take seriously that what they sold us, we also wanted. Let me underline this point with a recent example. Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil, excited outrage last month when he blamed the public for climate inaction. Quote, "The dirty secret nobody talks about is how much all this is going to cost and who's willing to pay for it. The people who are generating the emissions, that is all of us, need to be aware of and pay the price for generating them. That is how you solve this problem," end quote. Setting aside the likely hypocrisy, self-interest, and poor faith of Woods' claim, we nonetheless need to hear its truth, rather than quickly condemning it as, according to the Guardian newspaper, quote, "an attempt to skirt climate accountability," end quote. Such condemnations are their own variety of skirting accountability. Indeed, the climate activist group 350.org specifically exonerated all of us when it used Wood's claim to motivate a petition which read, quote, "Fossil fuel giants like ExxonMobil are to blame for the climate crisis, not us. If you agree, add your name," end quote. Likewise, the Guardian article cited a climate economist who compared Woods to a drug lord, quote, "blaming everyone but himself for drug problems," end quote. But if a drug lord is culpable, does that mean drug users are not? I am alarmed by so limited a notion of freedom, according to which we accept ourselves as powerless rather than endure a modicum of responsibility, as if freedom didn't imply responsibility, but instead was freedom from responsibility. This desired freedom from responsibility fuels the dream that we can meet the extraordinary challenges facing us without having to change substantively. We too easily accept that our civic responsibility is to consume rather than sacrifice, to vote on occasion, to write a check to a political candidate, PAC, party, or charity, or less often, to go to a protest, even while none of these demands what is more fundamentally needed, that each of us change. Our response can't be an exception from our normal lives. It has to be what's normal about them. The assumption that the heavy lifting can be accomplished only by governments or corporations exculpates us. It's not entirely untrue, which is why voting, donating, and protesting matter, but it also basically assures the status quo, while delivering us from having to consider how those governments and corporations truly represent us. Part of what can be recognized in those representations is despair. It seems that we don't, in our hearts, believe we can change. It seems that in our hearts, we accept that this representation, whether corporate or political, and despite regularly communicated contempt for it, still expresses the dark truth of who we are and of all we can become. We might as well resort to CGI creations of godlike superheroes because, despairing, we can't imagine ourselves as powerful agents otherwise. We have more faith in technology, including technological illusion, than in ourselves. What if we were to put faith elsewhere than the technological divine? What might that look like? I have 3 suggestions, each both simple and on the far side of human possibility. If we take them seriously, we must also take seriously why they are on the far side of human possibility. The 3 suggestions are: live small, not large; live slow, not fast; think differently. Rather than accepting the nihilistic premise that nothing you do matters, consider the exhilarating, terrifying premise that anything you do may matter. You may not know the ways it matters, to whom or to what. Mattering may not be reducible to meaning. But anything you do may matter, at least insofar as anything you do is matter. This is a consequence and expression of finitude. If we in our world were infinite, we could subtract or add to that infinity without changing it. But we in our world are finite. We and it must change. We are like that dream of Pierre described near the end of Tolstoy's War and Peace, where he sees a living, wavering globe consisting of drops tightly packed together. Every drop which moves and shifts causes other drops to move and shift in turn. So it is in our lives. Not one of us can move without moving something else. That seeming accident is a condition of possibility of every motion we make. Think about yourself finitely, pushing the earth to push off from it. An oil rig is not just ExxonMobil's. It also expresses you who are but several drops away. When you drive, your gasoline has traveled vast distances, and that's now part of your motion. That gasoline was once a fossil fuel deposit. Before that, it was a living being. Its carbon cycled many times through the food web before getting buried and over millions of years being compressed and transformed into something else, which one day we sucked from the earth and transported across the globe so that the controlled oxidation of it would propel your vehicle while once again accomplishing a new transformation, spiritualizing what was once alive into the gas trees breathe and you and I exhale. Being finite means being part of this enormous web, which you can't control or fully foresee, but within which you are not without freedom or responsibility. This web, this unavoidable mediation which finitude implies, is what geoengineering forgets. It's arguably what Descartes forgot. Both secretly infinitize us. Both imagine us as subjects fully present to ourselves for whom absolute agency is possible. For them, the drop each of us is doesn't shift or get shifted by other drops, but is isolatable. No web inextricably entangles us. And hence, surveying all that is, a subject can act with full consciousness. A subject can command itself to doubt. It can doubt away the entire world. And having found the seat of certainty in its own thinking, a disembodied and hence definitized thinking, it can then recreate and author the world. This is Descartes' trajectory in the Discourses and Meditations, as well as in another book that he wrote, which was actually titled The World. It's also the trajectory of technological illusion, which would replace the world that is with the illusion of a world we author. It's finally the trajectory, if not the task, of geoengineering. A famous climatologist argued that, given climate's susceptibility to small changes of initial conditions, the so-called butterfly effect, where the flapping of a butterfly's wings in one place contributes to a hurricane elsewhere. Given this susceptibility, he said, all we had to do was, quote, tame this butterfly, end quote. Were this climatologist more of a poet, we might hear irony in his claim. But what we might hear poetically as articulating a hubristic and hopeless project can also be heard as the assignment. It imagines that every butterfly can be tamed. But even more dangerously, it posits a tamer outside the web of mediations, a disembodied, decontextualized knower whose command to the legion of tame butterflies is itself beyond the jostle of any neighboring drop. Think differently. Picture yourself as a drop jostled by and jostling its neighbors. We must relentlessly reimagine ourselves thus. We must accustom ourselves regularly to undertake the thought experiment Rousseau challenges Emile with in the book of that title. Quote, we, that is Emile and his teacher, go to dine in an opulent home. We find the preparations for a feast. All this apparatus of pleasure and festivity has something intoxicating about it. While the meal continues, while the courses follow one another, while much boisterous conversation reigns, I lean toward Emile's ear and say, through how many hands would you estimate that all you see on this table has passed before getting here? What a crowd of ideas I awaken in his brain. Instantly, all the vapors of the delirium are dispelled. He dreams, he reflects, he calculates, he worries. While the philosophers, cheered by the wine, perhaps by the ladies next to them, prate and act like children, he is all alone philosophizing. What will he think of this luxury when he finds that every region of the world has been made to contribute? That perhaps 20 million hands have worked for a long time, that it has cost the lives of perhaps thousands of men, end quote. We must think in terms of 20 million hands and thousands of lost lives, not all of them human. And indeed, those numbers are surely underestimates. Even when simply walking the Placida, we should imagine that what energizes our steps were once living beings who stretched themselves toward the sun. We must, as best we can, make choices worthy of the sun-stretching creatures who enabled them, of 20 million hands and thousands of lost lives. This is not an exhortation not to live, to deny ourselves life, to do nothing because there is nothing untouched by 20 million hands and thousands of lost lives. Instead, it's an exhortation to live up to those hands and lives. Derrida describes such a comportment in these terms. Il faut bien manger, he wrote, but also il faut manger le bien, which, as a play on words, means several things. It means Of course we must eat, but we must also eat well. And not only that, we must eat the good. We must eat the good well. We must do it because we can't not do it. To be finite implies inexorably that we must eat the good, that no action is without reaction, no gain without loss. We can't not eat the good. We can't act in the world without the possibility of harm. We can't self-consciously leave no trace, nor is the trace which we may leave simply up to us. So what we can't not do, let us endeavor to do as well as we can. If this is not an exhortation not to live, neither is it an exhortation to embrace extravagance, to pronounce like Louis XV, "After me the flood." Look to the future. Look not only at the hands and lives of those who have touched what is already before you, but also to the hands and lives of those yet to come, who not you but your choices will touch. What entangles us stretches from past to future. Our actions may memorialize and prophesize. It is in this context of an imagined future, moreover one which no longer includes you or me, as well as in the context of imagining our global contemporaries who even now live lives much less replete than ours, that it makes sense to live small and slow. Put simply, if you do, you will use less and leave more for others. What I'm suggesting may sound naive, as if I'm unaware of the notorious problem of collective action. If each of our contributions is a mere drop in the ocean, why worry about my drop if no one else is worried about theirs? This argument of apathy, however, is just the flip side of the infinitization I'm critiquing. It posits that the only options are to be infinite or nothing. Such a coarse dichotomy has long characterized our thought. For example, we have long believed we could dump waste into the ocean or atmosphere and that, in effect, it would be infinitely diluted, that the vastness of ocean or atmosphere would reduce it to nothing. But it was, in fact, finitely diluted. Slowly, those drops have accumulated, so that now, for example, plastic, invented in 1907, is found in every region of Earth from the Himalayas to the deepest ocean trenches, as well as in our food, our bodies, and our mother's milk, to say nothing of the atmosphere's rising greenhouse gases. This whole lecture is about taking that disproportion between nothing and the infinite, a drop, seriously, about admitting that yes, you are a drop, but every drop matters. You matter. The pretense that drops don't matter expresses in one mode a diluted if aggrandizing infinitization, as if we count but only as infinite. But in another mode, the complement of our aggrandizing delusion, it confines each of us to a cell of impotent isolation, where our drops don't collectively constitute a wavering globe, much less our exalted, lonely individualities a world. But there is a world, a living, wavering globe of drops, in which each of us is a single drop who matters. Live small and slow and think differently for that world. This advice is more dramatic than it sounds. We easily dream of circumstances which will enable us to live as we imagine we like, without unwanted consequences. This is like imagining ourselves disembodied, mattering without being matter, meaning immaterially. It articulates a desire that we not be finite or mortal. I suspect that we live large and fast partly to distract ourselves from that finitude, from the death which awaits, as a substitute for the gigantic courage it takes to live even a single day. Yet such a response accelerates catastrophe. The illusion that we're infinite, that change can happen without us changing, is not a salve for our fragile mortality, but a destructive expression of it. It secretly confesses that none of us really believes we will die, as perhaps none of us really believes in climate change. There is another option, that we try to believe, that, trying to believe, we make an offering to the future and of the future, that we not insist that future be ours, that we let it be someone else's. The talk of a new green revolution sometimes sways this direction, but so long as it promises immense change which won't require us to change, it's a pipe dream, if not something more malevolent. A future we pretend to yield to another while secretly and stubbornly insisting that it remain ours. That pipe dream pretends that massive solar arrays, nuclear power, windmills, hydrogen, etc., will allow us to build for the future without giving up that future to someone else. It pretends that we can be responsible to the future without really changing our present, including without decreasing our consumption. Take energy, for example. We may dream that someday it will be boundless and free, but that will not happen. Energy will always come with consequences. Its production and use will require material infrastructure, likely including fossil fuel-intensive steel, concrete, and plastic. It will generate waste, including for nuclear energy, dangerous radioactive products whose half-lives can far exceed the history of human civilization. We shouldn't overlook that hydrogen, if it's to be our panacea, is a highly explosive panacea. And if a butterfly can cause a hurricane, what can a windmill do? Put otherwise, don't look to get something for nothing. That only amounts to the illusion of a good conscience. Don't trick yourself into believing you can give to the future without giving something up. Here's a more tangible form of this advice. We must pair attempts to choose energy sources more wisely with concerted efforts to use them more wisely, and specifically to reduce how much energy and matter we use. I'm ambivalent, but partly glad that the St. John Santa Fe campus has gone solar. I'd be more glad and less ambivalent if our solar conversion were accompanied by a campaign to reduce our energy use, if our murals enjoined us to take the next step rather than extolled the step already taken. Per capita energy consumption in the United States is among the highest of any nation. If we want to limit ourselves to only 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming, as dangerous as that may be, if we want to reduce global fossil fuel emissions by 50% in the next 6 years, we can't do it without dramatically reducing how much energy we use in ways which will present real but surmountable problems. Other first world countries consume per capita half the energy which Americans consume. I grant substantive differences exist between us and them, but it seems to me the most stubborn impediment to making real reductions in our energy consumption is not those differences, but our unimaginative and fantastical insistence that we shouldn't have to change. As a result, so much of the rest of the world strives to live like us when we desperately need to live more like them. Gandhi worried in 1928, quote, "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialism after the manner of the West. It would strip the world bare like locusts," end quote. But India and China and much of the rest of the world have taken to Western-style industrialism. And that stripped world which Gandhi dreaded is increasingly the reality before us, as the rest of the world follows our example while we refuse to follow theirs. My argument for living small and slow is not just that there's no other way to face the extraordinary challenges before us, and no better way to accustom ourselves to the lives we will eventually have to lead. It's also not just an ethical argument about living up to 20 million hands and thousands of lost lives, past and future. The third prong of my argument is what I've been saying about how the world reflects us. As much as we may want to blame governments, corporations, even capitalism, and as much as none of those are without blame, we still must take seriously that these reflect us. They express something that we must take responsibility for as our own. Our words may say, "End fossil fuels," but our actions take for granted their ready abundance. The only way I see to change that is to change how we consume, that is to say, how we eat, how we live, and how we think. We can't just talk about this. We have to do it. That means recognizing that no one is without responsibility for our predicament. Typically, if no one is without responsibility, no one is held responsible. But I'm saying each of us must hold ourselves responsible. Change is coming, whether we give assent or not. If we try to affirm it, we need to do more than vote, donate, protest, or go solar. We need to change. This may not sound revolutionary compared to a new green revolution, but of the two, which aren't mutually exclusive, I'm advocating the essential one. I'm not saying it will be sufficient if enough of us do our small part. Other things need to happen, including at corporate and political scales. But those things will not happen if enough of us don't do our small part. As much as we may like to believe we are victims of capitalism run amok, of ExxonMobil, of politicians, these also mirror us. They show us versions of ourselves. They give us what we, at least in part, ask for. Ask for something else. Become something else. Corporations, governments, and economic systems aren't simply controlling us. They're also expressing us. Any revolution without that admission is just a spinning of wheels. Some of the dread darkness of the political era into which so much of the world is falling stems from our propensity first to alienate, then to vilify our own reflections, while also believing that it is only those reflections which have the freedom, power, and burden of responsibility. What I've said today is not just about climate change. It's about how we are using up and running down the earth, and in parallel, exalting and diminishing ourselves. We see the earth as a pantry for us to raid, and as various stocks within it become depleted, we don't question our behavior or our assumptions, but merely look for new stocks. For the most part, we have not interrogated our prejudice that we are entitled to the earth, that it is ours to exhaust, that no other beings besides human beings, and perhaps even among them only some, truly matter. This exaltation we've implicitly bestowed upon ourselves is a kind of self-infinitization, whereby even the governance of the natural world falls under our thinly secularized technotheological sway. But in lockstep with it comes our diminishment as isolated individuals, impotent and unfree, incapable of response and of responsibility. In effect, nullities. Cast between these overtly dueling but secretly linked poles of the infinite and nothing, climate change becomes an avatar of our finitude. Ignore the avatar, and the threat will not retreat. But neither will it retreat should the avatar be addressed. That desired retreat follows from the false premise that our finitude is escapable. It is not. We are neither infinite nor nothing, but drop-like between the two. We need a response which endures that disproportion rather than through fantasy and denial embraces one end member or the other, thereby accelerating and compounding catastrophe. Some will hear me as prophesying doom, but I'm actually advocating hope. Not an easy hope, not a hope without effort or struggle or loss, not an empty hope which consoles by anesthetizing, but the harder and truer hope which admits that we must change and that we can. Something new is coming, just as it did at the end of the Cretaceous 65 million years ago in the form of an asteroid. That asteroid augured both calamity and immense possibility, the end or transformation of the dinosaurs, and the rise and transformation of the mammals. From it was born the once new world we recognize and sometimes love. A thin layer of the element iridium is sprinkled across the planet, marking that event and the boundary separating a world familiar to dinosaurs from one more familiar to us. Many now claim that we've entered a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. Since epochs typically last hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of years, I'm struck by the sheer optimism of that designation, which I find both endearing and repellent. How innocent and how hubristic that we think it's an epoch. It strikes me as far more likely that the Anthropocene will have been a boundary event, like the impact at the end of the Cretaceous, marked by a layer not of iridium, but of plastic, and distinguishing yet another new world from our now old and familiar one. This new world may not be ours. It doesn't need to be ours. A new world which includes us can't only be ours. Like the dinosaurs, if we are to persist, we must become something different, something smaller, something which, though almost as light as air, nonetheless greets morning with song. Thank you.